Project Stargate was the code name for a secret US government project established in 1991, and was a mission intended to use psychic and supernatural phenomenon for spying and military uses. It's been the subject of an incredible film, Third Eye Spies, which is now out worldwide. But as well as the controversial Project Stargate and the experimentation of remote viewing, the US certainly haven't stopped there and are renowned for carrying out secret projects and operations, some that have had a detrimental effect on those involved, and many of which are kept secret for many years, only to be vaguely classified and forgotten about. So just in time for the release of Third Eye Spies, which you can buy by clicking the link in the description or comments, here are 5 more secret projects and operations that have been carried out over the last few decades that we have not only been made aware of in recent years, but also raise some serious ethical questions. Sit back and enjoy. MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra was a top-secret mind control project conducted by the CIA. The project spanned nearly 20 years between 1953 and 1973, during which time hundreds of covert experiments were carried out on often unsuspecting US citizens to assess the potential use of LSD and other drugs for mind control, information gathering, and psychological torture. The unlawful program was not known to the public until 1975, after an investigation was carried out by Congress into widespread illegal CIA activities within the United States and around the world. The program was started at the height of the Cold War, when the US government feared that Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean agents were using mind control to brainwash US prisoners of war in Korea, and so aimed to develop techniques that could be used to control human behavior with mind-altering drugs and other psychological manipulators for brainwashing and psychological torture. As well as LSD, other things were used, including MDMA or ecstasy, heroin, barbiturates, psilocybin or magic mushrooms, and electroshock therapy on test subjects, who often had no idea they were participating in a study. Many of the experiments were conducted at universities, hospitals, or prisons in the United States and Canada. It's not clear how many people were involved in the tests, as the agency kept notoriously poor records, and most of the MK-Ultra documents were destroyed when the program officially closed in 1973. It's known that the LSD experiments were carried out under the direction of agency chemist and poison expert Sidney Gottlieb. One of the more controversial aspects of the project was Operation Midnight Climax, in which government-employed prostitutes lured unsuspecting men to CIA safe houses, where drug experiments took place. The men were dosed with LSD and then watched by CIA agents from behind a two-way mirror to gauge the drug's effects on the men's behavior. Recording devices were also installed in the prostitutes' rooms, disguised as electrical outlets. Most of these experiments took place in San Francisco, Marin County, and New York City, and the CIA agents involved later admitted that a freewheeling party-like atmosphere prevailed. The only known death linked to MK-Ultra was that of Frank Olson, a scientist who worked for the CIA. In 1953, at a CIA retreat, Olson drank a cocktail that had been secretly spiked with LSD. A few days later, on November 28, 1953, Olson plunged to his death from the window of a New York City hotel room in an alleged suicide. The family were never convinced of this, and in 1994 his body was exhumed and a second autopsy was carried out that revealed injuries on his body that had likely occurred before the fall. The findings sparked conspiracy theories that Olson might have been assassinated by the CIA. After prolonged legal proceedings, Olson's family was awarded a settlement of $750,000 and received a personal apology from then-President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby. Another notable participant in MK-Ultra was Ken Kesey, who volunteered for experiments with LSD while a student at Stanford University. He later went on to promote the drug, hosting LSD-fueled parties that he called acid tests, that combined drug use with musical performances and lighting effects. These parties influenced the early development of the 1960s hippie culture and the psychedelic drug scene. Ken Kesey later went on to write the 1962 novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In 1974, New York Times journalist Seymour Hersh published a story about how the CIA had conducted non-consensual drug experiments and illegal spying operations on US citizens. His report started the lengthy process of bringing long-suppressed details about MKUltra and other illegal CIA experiments carried out on unsuspecting citizens. The findings resulted in President Ford's 1976 Executive Order on Intelligence Activities that prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with their informed consent, in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party, of each some human subject. Sadly, it may have come too late for some, as the full impact of MKUltra experiments, including deaths, may never be known. Entomological warfare. In the 1950s, the US military, unbeknown to the public, carried out a range of tests using insects to determine how useful they could be in warfare. Here we look at 3 such operations and the uprising results they yielded. Operation Big Buzz was conducted in the US state of Georgia in 1955. It involved releasing over 300,000 mosquitoes from aircraft and using ground dispersal methods. The operation was to determine if the yellow fever mosquito could be successfully bred, stored and loaded into munitions, and whether they would survive and seek out food, namely blood. For the purpose of the trial, around 1 million uninfected female mosquitoes were bred, and after the 300,000 were released, the remaining mosquitoes were used in munitions loading and storage tests. The insects were dropped from aeroplanes 300 feet above the ground. Mosquitoes were later collected as far away as 2,000 feet from the release site, and it was proved they actively sought out blood meals from humans and other animals. Operation Big Itch involved using uninfected tropical rat fleas to determine their coverage and survivability as a carrier for biological agents. The tests were conducted in 1954 at Dugway Proving Ground, a controversial US Army facility in Utah, established in 1942 to test biological and chemical weapons. The fleas were loaded into 2 types of cluster bombs and dropped from the air via parachutes. However, one of the bombs failed during the tests and released 200,000 fleas into the aircraft, where they bit the pilot, bombardier, and observer. Despite this glitch, the test proved successful, and not only could the fleas survive the drop from an aeroplane, but they also soon attached themselves to hosts and covered a battalion-sized target area. There was a downside, however, as the fleas were only active for a 24-hour period. Operation Dropkick was a test conducted between April and November 1956 by the US Army Chemical Corps to test the practical use of mosquitoes to carry an entomological warfare agent in different ways. The uninfected female mosquitoes were released into a residential area of Savannah, Georgia. They then estimated how many mosquitoes entered houses and bit people. Within a day, the mosquitoes had bitten hundreds of people. The insects were then recovered using traps baited with dry ice. A similar experiment was carried out in 1958, when 600,000 mosquitoes were released in Avon Park, Florida. These tests proved that mosquitoes could be effective in hosting biological and chemical warfare. Details of these operations were only made known in 1981 in a partially declassified US Army report. Operation Sea Spray. Operation Sea Spray was a 1950 US Navy secret experiment in which supposedly harmless bacteria were sprayed over the San Francisco Bay Area in California. Its aim was to determine the susceptibility of a big city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack by terrorists. The one bacteria used, Bacterium serratia marcescens, lives in soil and water, and is best known for its ability to produce bright red pigment. This brightly coloured trait makes this particular microbe useful in experiments, as it's easy to see where it is. Over 6 days in September 1950, the crew of a US Navy minesweeper ship released the pathogens through a spray system off the shore of San Francisco. Based on results from monitoring equipment at 43 locations around the city, the Army ascertained that the 80,000 residents of the city had received enough of the bacteria for nearly all of them to inhale millions of particles each day during the week of spraying. At the time, the US military thought that the bacteria couldn't harm humans, and there was no evidence that the Army had alerted health authorities before it blanketed the region with bacteria. However, on October 11, 1950, 11 residents checked into Stanford Hospital with serious urinary tract infections. After testing their urine, doctors noticed the pathogens had a blue hue. Because infection with Serratia was also rare, the outbreak was extensively investigated by the university to identify the origins of the bug, and after scientists identified the microbe, the cases collectively became the first recorded outbreak of Serratia marcescens. And although 10 residents recovered, one patient, Edward J. Nevin, died 3 weeks later. None of the other hospitals in the city reported similar spikes in cases, and it was noted that all 11 victims had recently had medical procedures, suggesting that the source of their infections lay inside the hospital. Cases of pneumonia in San Francisco also increased after the bacteria was released, although a link to the release has not been conclusively established. The San Francisco experiment did not become public knowledge until 1976, and after they were released, doctors wondered whether the experiment might be responsible for heart valve infections around the same time, as well as serious infections seen among intravenous drug users in the 1960s and 70s. Operation Whitecoat. Operation Whitecoat was a biodefense program carried out by the US Army between 1954 and 1973. The program aimed to come up with a vaccine that would protect troops and civilians against biological weapons. Similar to most of these experiments conducted around this time, it was in the belief that the Soviet Union was engaging in similar studies. The research was carried out using conscripted personnel who were conscientious objectors and included many members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So the SDA Church established the Medical Cadet Corps training program. This allowed Adventists to support the war effort, but not fight. All of the volunteers were fully aware of what was being tested and gave their consent to participate. Over the course of the 19-year program, more than 2,300 conscripted US Army soldiers, many of whom were trained medics, contributed to the Whitecoat experiments by allowing themselves to be infected with bacteria that were considered likely choices for a biological attack. The near certainty of being assigned as a combat medic in Vietnam meant many of them chose instead to remain in the United States with the Whitecoat program. The volunteers who were infected were then treated with antibiotics to cure the infections. Some volunteers under the protocol were also given experimental vaccines for Q fever, as well as for yellow fever, Rift Valley fever, hepatitis A, and even the plague. Some of the soldier volunteers were given 2 weeks leave in exchange for being used as a test subject. Miraculously, no Whitecoats died during the test period. However, the Army has addressed for only 1,000 of the 2,300 people known to have volunteered, and only about 500 of the Whitecoats have been observed. A handful of respondents claim to have lingering health effects, and at least one subject claims to have serious health problems as a result of the experiments. It would be interesting to know what became of the 1,800 plus that haven't come forward. Project 112 and Project Shad. Project 112 was a highly classified military testing program that ran from 1962 to 1973, which was intended to test the effects of biological and chemical weapons on humans, animals, and plants in various combinations of climate, terrain, vehicles, ships, and equipment. The experiments took place on land and sea, and involved test subjects that had not been given informed consent. The project started under John F. Kennedy's administration, and was authorised by the then Secretary of Defence, Robert McNamara. Canada and the United Kingdom also participated in some of Project 112 activities. The project was coordinated from Deseret Test Center, Utah. At least 50 experiments were carried out, some of which involved simulants of biological agents and chemical agents, including sarin, tear gas, and others. Test sites included Porton Down in the UK, Ralston in Canada, and at least 13 US Navy warships. The shipborne trails were known as Shipboard Hazard and Defense, shortened to SHAD. The military categorically denied the existence of Project 112 and Project SHAD until May 2000. When it was exposed by CBS Evening News. The shocking report prompted the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs to begin the process of declassifying records about the project, and for the first time revealed to the personnel involved about the toxins they were unknowingly exposed to. During the experiments, agents and stimulants were usually dispensed as aerosols using spraying devices or bomblets. In one test carried out in May 1965, the anthrax simulant Bacillus globigii was released in the Washington, D.C. area at the Greyhound bus terminal and at the north terminal of the airport. In these tests, the bacteria was released from spray generators hidden in specially built briefcases. A series of tests were also carried out in June 1966 in the New York subway system by dropping light bulbs filled with bacteria. The results of this test indicated that if live bacteria was used, a city epidemic would have occurred. At no time were local authorities made aware of the operation. Project SHAD was designed to identify vulnerabilities in US warships in the event of a chemical or biological warfare attack. The sea-based tests were launched from ships such as the USS Granville S. Hall and USS George Eastman, as well as Army tugboats, submarines, and fighter aircraft. The goal was to learn how chemical or biological warfare agents would disperse throughout the ship, and to use that information to develop procedures to protect crew members and decontaminate ships. It was revealed that approximately 5,500 personnel took part in the tests, most without their knowledge. Most of the veterans that were unaware of their participation as human samplers were from Project SHAD, and many of the veterans now believe they were unwillingly exposed to agents, vaccines, and decontamination products that have led to serious medical problems, including cancer. However, the first report into long-term health effects of participation in Project SHAD, that was released in 2007, found there was no clear evidence linked to participation in the project. However, the second report, which began in 2012, is still ongoing. So that's 5 secret US government projects. If you love all this kind of thing, then you will love Third Eye Spies. It's an incredibly insightful documentary about what really goes on behind the scenes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you had an ability to be able to remotely perceive stuff any place in the world, that could be an extraordinary intelligence source.
We found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations.
Are you saying that the work you've been doing is classified?
It was a research facility. That was all that we were going to tell them.
The Russians have been spending millions of dollars investigating so-called ESP.
Psychic spies. Almost a psychic arms race here. Is there any real application to this?
I think remote viewing has been demonstrated over the 20 years of work that's been sponsored by the government.
Producing crucial and vital intelligence to the NSA, CIA, DEA, and the Secret Service.
I began to feel frightened.
The KGB did it, man.
What's really going on here?
State-sponsored assassination attempt.
The CIA was lying.
They wanted to kill the program.
A storm brewing.
This is real.
I say no more secrets.
Let this information out.